You are nothing more than a worthless temple rat, and even the scraps you carry are too good for something like you." High Priestess Vada's words cut through the morning air like sharpened silver, each syllable designed to remind Lyra exactly where she belonged in the sacred hierarchy of the Moon Temple. The cruel declaration echoed off the ancient stone walls, bouncing back to strike her again and again, as if the very architecture of this holy place conspired to amplify her worthlessness. Lyra felt the familiar sting settle deep in her chest, that practiced ache she had learned to carry like a second heartbeat. She kept her grey eyes fixed on the bucket of raw meat in her hands, watching the blood seep through the rough hemp cloth that lined the bottom. The metallic scent filled her nostrils, mixing with the incense that perpetually burned throughout the temple grounds, creating a combination that had become the signature smell of her daily humiliation. "The ancient sentinel grows restless," Vada continued, her voice dripping with the kind of disdain reserved for creatures found beneath one's boot. "Perhaps feeding him will be the first useful thing you accomplish in your miserable existence. Try not to get yourself killed. The blood would stain the sacred stones." Around them, other temple servants paused in their morning duties to witness this familiar ritual of degradation. Their expressions ranged from pity to relief that they were not the target of Vada's attention today. Lyra had learned long ago not to look for allies among them. Survival in the temple meant keeping your head down and avoiding notice, and associating with the most despised servant would only paint targets on their own backs. "Yes, High Priestess," Lyra murmured, the words automatic after years of practice. She had mastered the art of responding with just enough deference to avoid further punishment, while keeping her voice steady enough to preserve what remained of her dignity. The sacred grove lay at the heart of the temple complex, accessible only through a narrow stone pathway that wound between towering ancient oaks whose roots were said to drink from the same mystical springs that blessed the kingdom. As Lyra walked, she was hyper-aware of the stares following her from the nobles who had begun arriving for the morning blessing ceremony. Their whispered comments reached her ears in fragments. "How does the temple allow such creatures to tend the sacred areas? I heard she was found as a baby with no bloodline records, probably the bastard offspring of some rogue wolf. At least they keep her useful. Someone has to do the work no proper wolf would lower themselves to perform." Each comment landed like a small stone thrown at her back, but Lyra had learned to let them bounce off her practiced invisibility. She had spent 20 years perfecting the art of becoming nothing, of moving through spaces without disturbing the air around her, of existing so quietly that sometimes she wondered if she was real at all. The grove opened before her like a cathedral made of living wood, where shafts of golden morning light filtered through the canopy to dance across the forest floor. In the centre, surrounded by a ring of standing stones that predated the kingdom itself, lay the reason everyone feared this sacred space. Kairos raised his massive head as she approached, and Lyra felt her breath catch in her throat the way it did every morning when she first laid eyes on the ancient sentinel. He was enormous even by werewolf standards, his silver fur gleaming with an otherworldly luminescence that seemed to capture and reflect every ray of sunlight that touched him. His amber eyes held depths that spoke of centuries of wisdom, of battles fought and won, of secrets that existed before the first stone of the temple had been laid. Legend claimed that Kairos had been guardian of this grove since the first Alpha King had ruled, that he had watched kingdoms rise and fall, that he had refused to bow to any ruler who proved unworthy of his ancient recognition. Those same legends whispered that he had torn apart more than one would-be conqueror who had demanded his submission, leaving their bones to fertilize the roots of the sacred oaks. "Good morning, old one," Lyra said softly, setting the bucket of meat just outside the ring of stones as she had been taught. "I hope the night treated you kindly." Kairos studied her with those penetrating amber eyes, his expression unreadable. For a moment the entire grove fell silent except for the gentle rustle of leaves overhead and the distant sound of preparation from the temple complex. Then, as he had done every morning for the past 3 years since she had been assigned to this duty, he rose from his resting place and approached the offering. But today felt different. Today, the very air seemed to hum with an energy that made the fine hairs on Lyra's arms stand on end. She found herself holding her breath as the ancient wolf moved with liquid grace across the space between them, his massive paws making no sound on the forest floor despite his immense size. The sound of approaching footsteps on the stone pathway made Lyra's head turn toward the grove entrance. A procession of figures emerged from between the oaks, their presence immediately commanding attention, even from the ancient trees that seemed to bend slightly in acknowledgement of the power walking among their trunks. Alpha King Darius Blackthorn entered the sacred grove like a storm given human form, his dark hair gleaming almost black in the filtered sunlight, his powerful frame radiating the kind of dangerous authority that made lesser wolves instinctively lower their gazes. Behind him came his beta Marcus and a small entourage of the kingdom's most elite wolves, all of them dressed in ceremonial armour that caught the light like liquid metal. Lyra immediately dropped her gaze and stepped back against the trunk of the nearest oak, pressing herself into its bark as if she could become part of the tree itself. This was what she did when power walked too close to her insignificant existence. This was how she survived. "The traditional blessing before the ceremony," she heard Marcus explain to one of the younger wolves in the entourage. "The Alpha King must receive acknowledgement from the ancient Sentinel before any major political undertaking. It's been custom for over 3 centuries. Darius approached the ring of stones with confident strides, every movement speaking of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. The very air around him seemed to shimmer with barely contained power, and Lyra found her wolf stirring restlessly beneath her skin in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. She pressed harder against the oak tree, willing herself to become invisible, to disappear entirely, rather than risk drawing attention during such an important moment. But even as she tried to shrink away, she found her grey eyes drawn to the Alpha King's face, studying the sharp lines of his jaw, the way the morning light caught the gold flecks hidden in his dark eyes. Kairos lifted his massive head, fixing his ancient amber gaze on Darius with the kind of intensity that had made kings tremble throughout the centuries. The silence that followed was absolute, as if even the wind had paused to witness this meeting between old power and new. Then Kairos opened his muzzle and released a roar that shook the very foundations of the grove. The sound was nothing like the howl of an ordinary wolf. It was primal and fierce, carrying the weight of centuries and the promise of violence to any who dared presume dominance over him. Birds exploded from the canopy overhead in a thunder of wings, and several of Darius's entourage took involuntary steps backward, their hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. But Darius held his ground, his jaw tightening as he faced down the ancient Sentinel's challenge. Power radiated from him in waves, his alpha authority pressing outward like a physical force. For long moments the two magnificent creatures stared at each other across the sacred space, neither willing to yield. The ancient wolf bared his fangs, displaying teeth that could tear through armour as easily as parchment, his silver fur standing on end until he appeared even larger than his already intimidating size. His amber eyes blazed with a fury that spoke of his refusal to acknowledge this newcomer's claim to dominance, regardless of crown or title or political necessity. Lyra watched in fascination as the standoff continued, her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone in the grove could hear it. She had never seen anyone challenge Kairos before, had never witnessed the full display of his ancient power turned against another creature. Then, as if suddenly remembering her presence in the grove, Kairos turned his massive head toward her. The change was so immediate, so complete, that it seemed impossible. The rage vanished from his amber eyes, replaced by something that looked almost like relief. His hackles lowered, his fangs disappeared behind closed lips, and his enormous form began moving toward her with fluid grace. Lyra's breath caught in her throat as the ancient sentinel approached her position against the oak tree. She pressed harder against the bark, her mind racing with panic at the thought of drawing attention to herself during the Alpha King's blessing ceremony. This was wrong. This was not how things were supposed to happen. But Kairos paid no attention to her terror. Instead, he came to a stop directly in front of her and slowly, deliberately, lowered his massive silver head until it nearly touched the ground at her feet. The silence that followed was deafening. Lyra stared down at the ancient wolf's bowed head in complete shock, her mind struggling to process what she was witnessing. Kairos, the legendary sentinel who had refused to submit to 3 centuries of Alpha Kings, was bowing to her. To her, the worthless temple servant who carried his food scraps every morning. She heard a sharp intake of breath from somewhere behind her, then another, as the members of Darius's entourage realized what they were seeing. The impossibility of it seemed to hang in the air like a physical presence, challenging everything they thought they knew about power and hierarchy and the natural order of their world. "What in the goddess's name?" Marcus breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyra's gaze snapped up from Kairos's bowed form to find every eye in the grove fixed on her. The members of the entourage stared at her with expressions ranging from shock to confusion to something that might have been fear. But it was Darius's reaction that made her knees feel weak. The Alpha King was staring at her with an intensity that seemed to burn straight through her, his dark eyes wide with something she couldn't name. His powerful frame had gone completely still, as if he was afraid that any movement might shatter whatever spell had been cast over this sacred space. Then she felt it, a warmth spreading through her chest, golden and impossible and completely beyond her understanding. It pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, growing stronger with each second that Darius continued to stare at her with those penetrating dark eyes. Kairos lifted his head and made a sound deep in his throat, not quite a growl, but something far more complex. It sounded almost like approval, like an ancient creature expressing satisfaction with a choice well made. The ancient wolf then did something even more impossible. He turned his massive form toward Darius, but instead of the challenge or submission the Alpha King might have expected, Kairos moved to position himself between Lyra and the royal entourage. Not protectively, but as if presenting her to them, as if displaying something precious that had been hidden away for far too long. Behind Darius, she heard one of the younger wolves whisper, "The ancient guardian chooses the servant girl over the Alpha King. What does this mean?" But Lyra barely heard the question. Her entire world had narrowed to the golden warmth spreading through her chest and the way Darius was looking at her as if he was seeing her for the first time. As if she was something more than the worthless temple rat she had always been told she was. The thought was so dangerous, so impossible, that she immediately tried to push it away. But the warmth in her chest only grew stronger, and she had the terrifying suspicion that nothing would ever be the same again. The sacred grove had been transformed into something that belonged more to legend than reality. Every ancient oak draped with silver silk that caught the full moon's light and threw it back in cascades of ethereal radiance. Thousands of white flowers had been woven through the branches, their perfume mixing with the natural magic of the grove to create an atmosphere that seemed to pulse with divine approval. Lyra stood at the edge of the ceremonial circle, her reflection caught in pools of moonlit water that had been placed around the perimeter according to traditions that predated the kingdom itself. She wore the ancient mating robes of the Silver Moon bloodline, silk so fine it seemed to be woven from moonbeams themselves, embroidered with silver threads that traced the same runic patterns that marked her skin. The transformation of the past week felt like something from a dream. 7 days ago, she had been nobody, invisible and insignificant, carrying scraps to feed the ancient guardian while accepting cruelty as her natural due. Now she stood as Princess Lyra Silvermoon, victorious in ritual combat, acknowledged by every noble family in the kingdom, preparing to bond with the Alpha King before the goddess herself. "You look like starlight made flesh," Darius said softly, approaching through the grove with reverent steps. He wore traditional ceremonial robes in deep midnight blue, embroidered with golden threads that seemed to move and shift in the moonlight. But it was the expression in his dark eyes that made her breath catch in her throat. He looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in all the world, as if the sight of her standing in the sacred grove fulfilled every dream he had never dared to voice. "I still can't quite believe this is real," she whispered, her fingers tracing the silver embroidery on her sleeve. "That I'm here, that this is happening, that I'm worthy of any of it." Darius moved closer, his hands coming up to frame her face with the same reverence he might show to a holy relic. "You were always worthy, Princess Lyra. The rest of us were simply too blind to see what was standing before us." The assembled witnesses began to fill the grove, representatives from every major pack in the kingdom coming to witness a mating ceremony that would be spoken of for generations. But through it all, Lyra remained focused on the man before her, the mate who had risked everything to claim her, despite the political chaos it had created. Elder Thorn appeared at the edge of the ceremonial circle, his ancient robes marking him as the officiant who would bind their souls according to traditions that stretched back to the first Alpha Kings. In his gnarled hands he carried a chalice carved from a single piece of moonstone, its surface glowing with inner light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the mate bond that already connected them. "We gather beneath the sacred moon," Thorn began, his voice carrying clearly through the grove despite its apparent frailty, "to witness the bonding of true mates, chosen by destiny and blessed by the goddess herself. Let all who question the rightness of this union look upon the signs that heaven has provided and know that this is as it was meant to be." As if summoned by his words, Kairos emerged from the shadows at the edge of the grove, his massive silver form moving with the dignity befitting his ancient status. The great Sentinel took his place beside the ceremonial altar, his amber eyes reflecting the moonlight as he watched over the proceedings with protective approval. "The bloodlines," Thorn continued, gesturing toward them with the moonstone chalice. "Blackthorn, strong and true, protectors of the realm for 3 generations of kings, and Silvermoon, ancient beyond measure, the original royal line blessed by divine power and charged with the sacred duty of leadership." The words seemed to resonate through the very stones of the grove, and Lyra felt her wolf stir with recognition and pride. This was what she had been born for, what her bloodline had been preserved to accomplish despite 20 years of hiding and suppression. "The vows," Thorn said, offering the chalice first to Darius. "Speak your truth before the goddess and these witnesses." Darius took the cup with steady hands, his dark eyes never leaving Lyra's face as he spoke words that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. "I, Darius Blackthorn, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, take you, Princess Lyra Silvermoon, as my true mate. Before the goddess and these witnesses, I pledge my strength to protect you, my wisdom to guide our kingdom together, and my heart to love you for all the days of my life." He drank from the chalice, and immediately the mate bond flared brighter, visible as golden threads of light that seemed to weave their hearts together. When he offered the cup to Lyra, her hands were trembling only slightly as she accepted it. "I, Princess Lyra Silvermoon, heir to the ancient bloodline, take you, Darius Blackthorn, as my true mate," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word as confidence flowed through her like wine. "Before the goddess and these witnesses, I pledge my power to strengthen our bond, my compassion to temper your strength, and my love to stand beside you through whatever challenges await our kingdom." When she drank from the moonstone chalice, the liquid tasted like starlight and honey, sending warm fire through her veins that seemed to connect directly to the golden light that bound them together. The mate bond completion was unlike anything she could have imagined. A sense of wholeness that went deeper than physical or emotional. It was spiritual, fundamental, as if two halves of the same soul were finally reuniting after centuries of separation. "The marking," Thorn announced, and this was the part of the ceremony that Lyra had both anticipated and feared. In traditional mating ceremonies, the alpha would mark his mate with teeth and claw, leaving permanent scars that proclaimed her status to the world. But as Darius moved closer, his eyes blazing with golden fire as his wolf pressed close to the surface, something extraordinary began to happen. Instead of the violent marking that tradition demanded, silver light began to emanate from Lyra's skin where his hands touched her. The ancient magic of the Silver Moon bloodline responded to the completion of the mate bond, and intricate patterns began to appear on both their skin, traced in light that seemed to burn from within. The assembled crowd gasped as they witnessed something that had been spoken of only in the oldest legends. The divine marking, created not by violence but by the goddess herself, proclaiming their bond in patterns that no earthly force could replicate or remove. On Lyra's throat, a collar of silver stars appeared, each one pulsing with the rhythm of her heartbeat. On Darius's chest, directly over his heart, a crescent moon blazed in gold that seemed to echo the silver of her markings. They were marked not just as mates, but as equal partners, chosen rulers whose bond transcended ordinary understanding. "The wolves," Thorn whispered, his ancient voice filled with awe. "Let the sacred forms witness and celebrate." They transformed together, and even in wolf form the divine markings remained visible, blazing like celestial fire against their fur. Lyra's silver wolf stood beside Darius's magnificent black form, and for a moment the two creatures moved in a dance as old as time itself, circling each other with movements that spoke of perfect unity and complementary strength. When they howled together, their voices rising in harmonious celebration, every wolf in the grove joined them. The sound echoed across the entire kingdom, a proclamation of the completed bond that reached every pack territory, every remote mountain village, every corner of the realm they would now rule together. As they shifted back to human form, both breathing hard from the intensity of the ceremony, Lyra realized that something fundamental had changed, not just in her relationship with Darius, but in her understanding of herself. The frightened servant girl who had carried scraps to the ancient guardian was gone completely, replaced by a queen who stood as equal partner to the most powerful alpha in the kingdom. "Lunar Queen Lyra," Darius said softly, the title rolling off his tongue like a prayer. "My mate, my equal, my heart." "My king," she replied, her voice steady and sure as she spoke words that would have terrified her just days before. "My mate, my strength, my home." The gathered witnesses began to approach, offering bows and congratulations to their newly bonded rulers. But through it all, Lyra remained focused on the man beside her, the mate whose recognition had awakened her from 20 years of believing she was nothing. Elder Thorn approached them with the ancient crown that had been crafted for the Silver Moon bloodline, its silver circlets set with moonstones that seemed to capture and hold starlight. "The crown of queens," he said reverently, waiting 20 years for its rightful bearer to return. As Darius placed the circlet on her head with hands that trembled slightly from the magnitude of the moment, Lyra felt the final piece of her destiny settle into place. She was no longer the lost princess seeking her place in the world. She was Lunar Queen Lyra Silvermoon Blackthorn, equal ruler of the Northern Territories, bonded mate to the Alpha King, and living proof that sometimes the most precious things are hidden in the most unexpected places. The ceremony concluded with the traditional feast, but as dawn began to creep across the horizon and the assembled guests slowly dispersed to spread word of the miraculous bonding throughout the kingdom, Lyra found herself alone with her mate in the grove where it had all began. "No regrets?" Darius asked softly, his arms around her waist as they stood together beneath the ancient oaks. "Only that it took us so long to find each other," Lyra replied, leaning back against his chest as she watched the sun rise over their kingdom. "And gratitude that the goddess was patient enough to wait for us to recognize what was meant to be." The mate bond hummed between them like a song of contentment, and as Kairos settled down nearby to watch over them with ancient satisfaction, Lyra knew that this was only the beginning of their story together. She had been invisible for 20 years, accepting worthlessness as her natural state. Now she stood as queen beside the man she loved, ready to face whatever adventures awaited them with the confidence that came from being exactly who she was born to be. The lost princess had found her way home at last. 3 months had passed since the sacred grove had witnessed the bonding of true mates, and the kingdom had transformed under the combined rule of Alpha King Darius and Lunar Queen Lyra, in ways that even the most optimistic advisors had not dared to predict. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the royal council chamber as Lyra reviewed petitions from citizens across the territories, her silver crown catching the light as she worked with the focused attention that had surprised even her most sceptical critics. "The mining dispute in the Eastern Territories has been resolved," she reported to Darius, who sat beside her at the great oak table that had served the kingdom's rulers for generations. "Both parties agreed to the mediation terms, and production has resumed with fair compensation for all workers involved." It had taken weeks for the nobles to adjust to the reality of a queen who actually listened to the concerns of common citizens, who insisted on hearing petitions from servants and farmers with the same attention she gave to matters of high politics. But the results spoke for themselves. Civil disputes that had festered for years were being resolved through her patient diplomacy, and the kingdom's prosperity had grown markedly under their joint leadership. "And the western border situation?" Darius asked, though the pride in his voice suggested he already knew the answer. "The 3 pack leaders who were threatening to break away have all agreed to renewed loyalty oaths," Lyra replied with satisfaction. Once they understood that their concerns about territorial rights were being taken seriously rather than dismissed, the negotiations became remarkably straightforward. Darius reached over to take her hand, the mate bond flaring with warm contentment as their fingers intertwined. "You continue to amaze me, Lunar Queen. Your diplomatic instincts are transforming how this kingdom operates." The transformation had been remarkable to witness. Lyra's natural compassion, honed by 20 years of understanding what it meant to be powerless and dismissed, had proven to be exactly what the kingdom needed. She approached every problem with the assumption that reasonable people could find reasonable solutions if they were simply heard and respected, and her success rate had converted even the most traditional nobles to her methods. But it wasn't just her political skills that had proven valuable. The ancient power of the Silver Moon bloodline had grown stronger with each passing day, and her connection to the supernatural aspects of leadership had brought stability to regions that had been struggling with mystical disturbances for decades. "The sacred groves report that the imbalance in the northern forests has been completely corrected," Marcus announced as he entered the council chamber with the morning's intelligence reports. "The grove spirits are responding to Lunar Queen Lyra's presence with unprecedented cooperation." It was true. Something about her royal bloodline seemed to calm the ancient magics that occasionally stirred unrest in the kingdom's more mystically active regions. Villages that had dealt with troublesome spirits for generations found peace within days of her visits, and the kingdom's magical defences had never been stronger. Any word from the Southern Territories about trade negotiations?" Darius asked, though his attention seemed more focused on the way the morning light caught the silver markings on his mate's throat than on matters of commerce. "Lord Aldrich sent word that the terms are acceptable," Marcus replied, with barely concealed amusement at his king's obvious distraction. "Though I suspect his enthusiasm has more to do with Lunar Queen Lyra's reputation for fair dealing than with the specific details of grain imports." The past 3 months had seen a parade of foreign dignitaries seeking audiences with the legendary lost princess who had become queen, all of them curious to meet the woman whose return had been accompanied by such obvious divine blessing. The divine markings that had appeared during their mating ceremony had only grown more intricate with time, silver stars now tracing delicate patterns along Lyra's arms that pulsed with gentle light whenever she used her supernatural abilities. "The council session can wait until this afternoon," Darius said decisively, standing and offering his hand to his mate. "I believe the Lunar Queen has earned some time away from administrative duties." Lyra accepted his assistance with the graceful dignity that had become second nature over the past months, though her grey eyes sparkled with the kind of mischief that suggested she knew exactly what her mate had in mind. "And what did you have in mind for this break from royal responsibilities, my king?" "A walk through the sacred grove," he replied, his voice carrying undertones that had nothing to do with casual strolling and everything to do with the private time they had learned to steal between the endless demands of ruling a kingdom. "I believe Kairos has been feeling neglected." They made their way through the palace corridors with the easy familiarity of partners who had learned to move in perfect synchronization, acknowledging bows and greetings from servants and nobles alike, while maintaining the kind of connection that made it clear to everyone around them that they remained as devoted to each other as they had been on their bonding night. The sacred grove welcomed them with the scent of jasmine and the whisper of ancient leaves, and Kairos raised his massive head from where he rested in the dappled sunlight, his amber eyes bright with what looked suspiciously like approval. The great Sentinel had become something of a guardian spirit to their relationship, often appearing at moments when they needed the reminder of how far they had come. "He still looks at you like you're the most miraculous thing he's ever seen," Lyra observed, settling gracefully on the soft grass beside the ancient wolf, while Darius lowered himself to sit behind her, his arms coming around her waist in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "He recognizes true royalty," Darius replied, pressing a kiss to the silver markings on her throat that made her shiver with pleasure. "Just as I did eventually." The mate bond hummed between them with contentment and deep satisfaction, but underneath the peaceful surface Lyra could feel something else stirring. A secret she had been carrying for the past week, a development that would change their lives in ways that filled her with both excitement and nervous anticipation. "Darius," she said softly, turning in his arms so she could see his face directly. "There's something I need to tell you." The seriousness in her tone made him focus completely on her, his dark eyes searching her expression for any sign of trouble or distress. "What is it, love? Is something wrong?" "Not wrong," she said quickly, her hands coming up to frame his face as she had seen him do so many times when he wanted her complete attention. "Quite the opposite, actually. Darius, I'm pregnant." For a moment he went completely still, his expression shifting from concern to shock to something that looked like wonder beyond words. "Pregnant," he repeated, as if testing how the word felt on his tongue. 3 weeks along, according to the palace healer, Lyra confirmed, her voice filled with the kind of quiet joy that came from sharing momentous news with the person who mattered most. "The bloodlines will continue. Our child will carry both Blackthorn strength and Silvermoon magic." The smile that spread across Darius's face was like sunrise breaking over mountains, transforming his entire expression with pure, unfiltered happiness. "A child," he breathed, his hands moving to rest gently on her still flat stomach. "Our child." "The heir to everything we've built together," Lyra agreed, covering his hands with her own as she felt tears of joy streaming down her face. "The next generation of a dynasty that will rule with both strength and compassion." Kairos lifted his great head and released a howl that seemed to carry approval and celebration across the entire grove, as if the ancient Sentinel understood the significance of what had just been shared and wanted to add his blessing to the news. "The kingdom will rejoice," Darius said, his voice rough with emotion as he pulled her closer, careful now of the precious life growing within her. A child born of the mate bond, carrying the blood of two of the most powerful lineages in our history. But even as they celebrated the miracle of new life, Lyra found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago she had been nobody, invisible and forgotten, carrying scraps to feed the ancient guardian while believing herself to be worthless. Now she sat as queen beside the man she loved, expecting their first child, surrounded by the evidence of how far destiny could lift someone when they finally learned to embrace who they truly were. "I love you," she whispered against his lips as he kissed her with reverent tenderness. "My mate, my king, the father of my children." "I love you beyond measure," he replied, the words carrying the weight of absolute truth. "My queen, my heart, my home." As they sat together in the grove where their love had first been recognized, where the ancient guardian had seen what no one else had been able to perceive, Lyra felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing she had found her place in the world at last. She was no longer the lost princess seeking recognition or the frightened servant girl accepting cruelty as her due. She was Lunar Queen Lyra, beloved mate, expectant mother, and living proof that sometimes the most extraordinary destinies are hidden in the most ordinary places, waiting for the right moment to unfold in all their magnificent glory. And this was only the beginning of the legacy they would build together. 6 months later, the royal balcony overlooked a kingdom transformed beyond recognition, its prosperity evident in every gleaming rooftop and bustling marketplace that stretched to the horizon. Lunar Queen Lyra stood at the stone railing, her hands resting protectively over the pronounced curve of her belly where their child grew strong and healthy, responding to both parents' voices with movements that spoke of supernatural awareness even before birth. The evening breeze carried the scent of jasmine and contentment across the palace grounds, and in the distance she could see the sacred grove where Kairos still kept his patient vigil, the ancient Sentinel's presence a constant reminder of how far they had all come since that first impossible morning when he had bowed to a servant girl carrying scraps. "The trade delegations from the Eastern Kingdoms arrived this afternoon," Darius said as he joined her on the balcony, his arms encircling her from behind with the careful protectiveness that had marked every day since they had learned about their coming child. "They're eager to establish formal agreements with the kingdom that managed to achieve such remarkable stability in so short a time." Lyra leaned back against his chest, feeling the familiar warmth of the mate bond pulse between them as their unborn child responded to his proximity with a series of gentle kicks. "And the southern territories?" "Complete integration," he replied with satisfaction, his hands coming to rest over hers on their child's temporary home. "The last of the holdout packs pledged their loyalty yesterday. For the first time in 3 generations, every territory within our borders is united under a single crown." It had been a remarkable transformation to witness and experience. The kingdom that had once struggled with internal disputes and territorial tensions had become a model of cooperative governance, with representatives from every pack working together to ensure prosperity for all citizens, regardless of rank or bloodline. "Your diplomatic methods have revolutionized how we approach governance," Darius continued, his voice filled with the same wonder that had marked his tone since the day he had first recognized what she truly was. "The nobles still speak in amazement about your ability to find common ground where others saw only irreconcilable differences." But Lyra's thoughts had drifted to a deeper reflection, one that encompassed not just their political achievements, but the personal journey that had brought her to this moment of perfect contentment. 6 months ago she had been struggling to understand how a servant girl could possibly deserve the love of an alpha king, how someone who had been told she was worthless could suddenly be expected to help rule a kingdom. Now she understood that worth had never been something external to be granted or withheld by others. It had always existed within her, waiting for the right moment and the right recognition to bloom into its full potential. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Kairos hadn't chosen to acknowledge me that morning?" she asked softly, her fingers tracing the silver markings on her arms that had grown more intricate with each month of their bonding. "Never," Darius replied without hesitation, his lips brushing against the mark on her throat that proclaimed her as his equal partner. "Destiny would have found another way to bring us together. The mate bond was too strong, too fundamental, to be denied by anything as simple as social expectations or political arrangements." Their child kicked strongly, as if responding to the certainty in his voice, and Lyra laughed softly at the enthusiastic movement. The palace healer had confirmed what they had both suspected. The baby carried supernatural abilities that were already manifesting, responding to emotions and magical energies with a sensitivity that spoke of the combined power of both bloodlines. "She's going to be extraordinary," Lyra murmured, her hands moving in soothing circles over her belly as the active movements began to settle. "She?" Darius asked, though his tone suggested he had suspected the same thing. "I've been dreaming about her," Lyra admitted, turning in his arms to face him directly. "Silver eyes like moonlight, hair as dark as yours, and a presence that commands attention even as an infant. She's going to be everything this kingdom needs for the next generation." The smile that spread across Darius's face held depths of joy and anticipation that made her heart flutter with the same excitement she had felt on their bonding night. "Princess Luna," he said, testing the name they had both been considering. "The next generation of the Silver Moon legacy." "Princess Luna Blackthorn," Lyra corrected gently. "She'll carry both bloodlines equally, just as we rule this kingdom together." As if summoned by the mention of her future title, their daughter responded with a series of movements that felt almost like dancing, and both parents laughed at the obvious approval their unborn child was expressing. The sound of approaching footsteps made them turn toward the balcony entrance, where Elder Thorn appeared with the patient smile that had marked all his interactions with them since their bonding ceremony. In his hands he carried a small bundle wrapped in ancient silk, its contents clearly precious beyond measure. "Forgive the interruption, your majesties," he said with the formal courtesy that still felt strange to Lyra despite months of royal protocol. "But I believe the time has come to present the princess with her inheritance." He unfolded the silk to reveal a tiny crown, clearly crafted for an infant, but bearing the same intricate silverwork that marked Lyra's own royal circlet. It was beautiful beyond description, set with moonstones that seemed to hold captured starlight, designed to grow with its wearer until she reached her full adult status. "The crown of the heir," Thorn explained softly. "Crafted by the same artisans who created your own, blessed by the same ancient rituals, waiting for the next princess to be born to the Silver Moon bloodline." Lyra felt tears streaming down her face as she looked at the tangible proof that their daughter's destiny was already being acknowledged and prepared for. This child would never know the uncertainty and worthlessness that had marked her own early years. She would be born into love and recognition, surrounded by those who understood exactly how precious she was from her very first breath. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, as Darius accepted the crown, with hands that trembled slightly from the magnitude of the moment. "There is one more thing," Thorn continued, his ancient eyes twinkling with something that looked like profound satisfaction. "A message from Kairos. The ancient Sentinel wishes it known that he will remain to guard the next generation, just as he guarded you until the time came for your awakening." The promise sent warmth flooding through Lyra's entire being. The great wolf who had been the first to recognize her worth would be there to watch over their daughter, to ensure that the next Silvermoon princess grew up surrounded by the same mystical protection that had kept the bloodline safe for generations. As Thorn departed, leaving them alone with the crown that represented their daughter's future and their kingdom's continuation, Lyra found herself overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of how much her life had changed. From worthless servant to beloved queen, from invisible nobody to the centre of a love story that would be told for generations. "I love you," she said, the words carrying the weight of everything they had built together and everything they still planned to achieve. "I love you beyond reason, beyond measure, beyond anything I ever thought possible," Darius replied, his voice rough with the depth of his emotion. "My queen, my mate, my heart, the mother of my children, my equal in all things." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above their kingdom, as the first sounds of evening celebration drifted up from the villages below, Lyra felt the deep peace that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged. She was no longer the girl who had believed she was nothing, who had accepted cruelty and dismissal as her natural due, who had carried scraps to the ancient guardian while dreaming of a life that seemed impossible. She was Lunar Queen Lyra Silvermoon Blackthorn, beloved mate to the most powerful alpha in the kingdom, expectant mother to the next generation of leaders, and living proof that sometimes the most extraordinary destinies are hidden in the most ordinary moments, waiting for someone brave enough to recognize them. And as their daughter stirred within her, responding to the love and contentment that surrounded her even before birth, Lyra knew that this was not an ending, but a beginning. The next chapter of a legacy that would span generations, built on the foundation of a love that had overcome every obstacle and emerged stronger for the trials it had faced. The lost princess had found her way home, claimed her crown, and discovered that her worth had never depended on anyone else's recognition. It had always been there, waiting for her to believe in it herself, and now that belief would be passed down to their daughter, ensuring that the next generation would never know what it meant to feel worthless or invisible or forgotten. The bloodline would continue, the kingdom would prosper, and love would triumph over every challenge that dared to threaten what they had built together. This was their happily ever after, and it was more beautiful than any fairy tale could ever hope to be. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky by the time Darius finally tore his gaze away from the impossible scene in the sacred grove, but the image remained burned into his mind like a brand. The ancient Sentinel, legendary for his refusal to bow to any living creature, lowering his massive silver head to a temple servant girl as if she were royalty itself. "Marcus," Darius said quietly, his voice carrying the controlled tension of a man trying to maintain composure when his entire worldview had just shifted beneath his feet. "I want to know everything about that girl, her name, her bloodline, where she came from, why she's here." His beta stepped closer, lowering his voice so the rest of the entourage couldn't hear. "My lord, she's just a servant. Surely the Ancient One was simply confused, or perhaps sensing something we don't understand about the grove's magic today." But Darius shook his head slowly, his dark eyes still fixed on the spot where Lyra had pressed herself against the oak tree, before fleeing the moment his attention had shifted to his men. "No, there was nothing confused about what I witnessed. Kairos chose her, Marcus, deliberately, definitively. I've never seen anything like it." What he didn't tell his beta was that he could still feel the golden warmth that had flared in his chest the moment the ancient wolf had bowed to the girl. It pulsed there now like a second heartbeat, foreign and impossible and absolutely undeniable. He had felt something similar only once before, years ago, when his father had described the mate bond to him as a young man. But that was impossible. She was nobody. She was nothing. She was magnificent. The thought came unbidden and so startling that Darius nearly took a physical step backward. Where had that come from? She was a servant, thin and pale, from a lifetime of hard work and poor meals, dressed in the rough brown robes that marked her as the lowest rank in the temple hierarchy. Her grey eyes had been wide with terror when she'd looked at him, and she'd fled the grove the moment she could move without drawing more attention to herself. And yet something about the way she'd spoken softly to Kairos, the gentle respect in her voice as she'd greeted the ancient sentinel, had made Darius's wolf stir with interest. His wolf, who had shown indifference to every noble-born female who had been paraded before him over the years, including his own betrothed. "Find out everything," he repeated to Marcus, his tone making it clear this was not a request. "Quietly. I don't want the temple hierarchy alerted to our interest, and I especially don't want word of this reaching Lady Seraphina before we understand what happened here today." Marcus nodded, though his expression suggested he thought his Alpha King might be overthinking a simple anomaly. "Of course, my lord. I'll begin inquiries immediately." But as the royal entourage made their way back toward the main temple complex, Darius found himself glancing over his shoulder toward the grove, as if hoping to catch another glimpse of the girl who had somehow earned the ancient sentinel's recognition. The golden warmth in his chest pulled in that direction like a compass needle seeking true north, and he had to physically resist the urge to abandon his entire schedule and return to search for her. This was madness. He was the Alpha King, bound by duty and political necessity to marry Lady Seraphina in 3 days' time. Their union would solidify the alliance between the northern and western territories, ensuring peace and prosperity for both kingdoms. He had obligations that stretched far beyond personal desire, responsibilities that affected the lives of thousands of wolves under his protection. But as he walked through the temple corridors, acknowledging the bows and greetings of priests and nobles alike, his mind kept returning to those terrified grey eyes and the way she'd tried to disappear into the oak tree rather than face his attention. Something about her vulnerability had awakened every protective instinct in his alpha nature, even as the mystery of Kairos's behaviour demanded investigation. Meanwhile, in the servant quarters deep beneath the main temple structure, Lyra sat on her narrow cot with her hands pressed against her chest, trying to understand the golden warmth that continued to pulse there like a living thing. She had run from the grove the moment she could move without causing further disruption, her heart hammering so hard she'd been certain it would give out entirely. What had happened in that sacred space defied everything she thought she knew about the world. Kairos had bowed to her. The ancient Sentinel, terror of kings and alphas for 3 centuries, had lowered his magnificent head to a worthless temple servant, and the Alpha King had stared at her as if she were something precious rather than the insignificant creature everyone knew her to be. The memory of his dark eyes studying her face made the warmth in her chest flare brighter, and she pressed her hands harder against her ribs as if she could contain whatever this feeling was. She had no right to think about the Alpha King, no right to remember the way he'd looked at her as if seeing something no one else had ever noticed. He was beyond her reach in every possible way, bound to marry the beautiful Lady Seraphina in a union that would strengthen both their kingdoms. A soft knock at her door made her jump, and she quickly wiped away the tears she hadn't realised were falling. "Come in." Mira, one of the kitchen servants and the closest thing Lyra had to a friend in this place, peeked around the doorframe with wide, curious eyes. "Lyra, is it true? Did the ancient Sentinel really bow to you in front of the Alpha King?" Word travelled fast in the temple, especially when it involved something as unprecedented as what had occurred in the sacred grove. Lyra sighed and nodded, unable to deny what so many had witnessed. "Sweet goddess," Mira breathed, slipping into the small room and closing the door behind her. "What do you think it means?" "I think it means I'm in trouble," Lyra said quietly. "High Priestess Vada was already looking for reasons to make my life more difficult. Now I've somehow disrupted the Alpha King's blessing ceremony and made a spectacle of myself in front of the entire royal entourage." But even as she spoke the words, she couldn't shake the memory of how right it had felt when Kairos had approached her, how the ancient wolf's amber eyes had held something that looked almost like recognition, as if he had been waiting for her specifically, as if her presence in the grove had been the missing piece of some puzzle she didn't understand. The golden warmth pulsed again, and this time she was certain it was connected to her thoughts of the Alpha King, which was impossible and dangerous and absolutely foolish for someone in her position to even consider. 3 floors above, in chambers befitting his royal status, Darius found himself pacing before the tall windows that overlooked the temple grounds. He had dismissed his entourage for the afternoon, claiming the need to prepare for tomorrow's pre-ceremony rituals, but in reality he simply needed space to think about what he had witnessed. Every instinct he possessed as both man and wolf was telling him that the servant girl was important, that her connection to the ancient Sentinel meant something significant for his kingdom and his future. But his rational mind insisted that he was reading far too much into what could have been a simple anomaly, a momentary confusion on the part of an ancient creature whose motivations were beyond human understanding. A soft knock at his chamber door interrupted his internal struggle. "Enter." Lady Seraphina glided into the room like poetry made flesh, her golden hair perfectly arranged despite the afternoon heat, her emerald silk gown highlighting the classical beauty that had made her the most sought-after match among the noble families. She was everything a lunar queen should be: elegant, educated, politically savvy, and blessed with the kind of refined beauty that would look magnificent beside him on the throne. So why did the sight of her leave him feeling empty rather than satisfied? "My lord," she said, offering the perfect curtsy that spoke of years of training in royal protocol. "I heard there was some disruption during your blessing ceremony this morning. I wanted to ensure that everything is proceeding smoothly for our union." Darius studied his betrothed's face, noting the slight tension around her green eyes that suggested she already knew more about the morning's events than her casual tone implied. Seraphina had an extensive network of informants throughout both kingdoms, a political skill that would serve her well as Lunar Queen, but sometimes made him feel as if he were constantly being evaluated rather than loved. "A minor incident," he said carefully, "nothing that affects our ceremony." But Seraphina's smile sharpened slightly, and he realized she wasn't going to let the matter drop so easily. "I heard that the ancient Sentinel showed unusual behavior toward one of the servants. How curious that such a creature would break centuries of tradition for someone so insignificant." The casual dismissal in her voice, the way she spoke of the temple servant as if discussing an annoying insect, made something dark stir in Darius's chest. His wolf, which had remained relatively calm in Seraphina's presence for the past 2 years of their courtship, suddenly felt restless and protective. "Perhaps," he said, his tone carefully neutral, "the Ancient One sees something the rest of us have missed." Seraphina's laugh was like silver bells, beautiful and cold. "My lord, surely you don't suggest that a temple servant could possess anything of value that has escaped the notice of the kingdom's finest bloodline trackers?" "She's nobody, Darius. A foundling with no family, no pack, no heritage worth mentioning. Whatever happened in that grove was merely an animal's momentary confusion." Each word felt like a small blade sliding between his ribs, and Darius realized with startling clarity that he didn't want to hear Seraphina speak about the servant girl this way. He didn't want to hear anyone speak about her this way, which was a dangerous and completely irrational reaction for a man who didn't even know her name. "Perhaps you're right," he said, though the golden warmth in his chest pulsed with what felt like disagreement. "I should focus on the future rather than dwelling on minor disruptions." Seraphina moved closer, her hand coming to rest on his arm with practiced grace. "Exactly. We have a kingdom to rule together, Darius. Don't let yourself be distracted by insignificant anomalies when our union will bring such prosperity to both our peoples." But as she spoke, all Darius could think about were terrified grey eyes and the way the ancient Sentinel had positioned himself as if presenting something precious that had been hidden away for too long. The golden warmth spread through his chest like liquid fire, and for the first time since his betrothal had been arranged, he found himself questioning whether political necessity was worth the cost of ignoring what his wolf was trying to tell him. That night, as darkness settled over the temple complex, Lyra made her way through the corridors toward the servants' kitchen for her evening meal. The golden warmth in her chest had only grown stronger throughout the day, and she had begun to notice that it seemed to pulse more intensely whenever her thoughts turned toward the Alpha King, which was often, despite her best efforts to focus on her duties and forget about the impossible moment in the sacred grove. She was so lost in thought that she almost walked directly into the solid chest of someone standing in the shadowed alcove near the kitchen entrance. Her gasp of surprise died in her throat when she looked up and found herself staring into the familiar dark eyes of Alpha King Darius himself. He was alone, without the entourage that usually surrounded him, dressed in simple dark clothing rather than his ceremonial robes. In the dim torchlight of the corridor, he looked younger somehow, less intimidating, though his presence still made her wolf stir restlessly beneath her skin. "I was hoping to find you," he said quietly, his voice lacking the formal tone he had used in the grove that morning. "I realize I don't even know your name." "Lyra," she whispered, her throat suddenly dry. "My lord, I should not—" "Darius," he interrupted gently. "My name is Darius, and I think, after what happened in the grove today, we should speak as equals rather than lord and servant." The suggestion was so shocking that Lyra actually took a step backward, pressing herself against the stone wall of the corridor. "My lord, I could never—" "The ancient Sentinel saw something in you," Darius continued, moving slightly closer, but stopping when he noticed her instinctive retreat. "Something that made him choose you over me, over centuries of tradition. I need to understand what that was." The golden warmth in her chest blazed brighter, and Lyra realized with growing alarm that it was responding to his proximity. The closer he stood, the stronger the sensation became, until it felt like a living thing writhing beneath her ribs. "I don't know," she said honestly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been asking myself the same question all day. I'm nobody, my lord. I have no bloodline, no family, no power. I don't understand why Kairos chose to acknowledge me any more than you do." Something flickered in Darius's dark eyes at her words, an expression she couldn't quite name. "Maybe that's the problem," he said softly. "Maybe we've all been looking at this wrong. Maybe you're not nobody at all." The words hung between them in the shadowed corridor like a promise and a threat, and Lyra felt her carefully constructed world of invisibility and worthlessness beginning to crack around the edges. The golden warmth spread through her chest like wildfire, and she had the terrifying suspicion that Alpha King Darius might be able to see straight through every defense she had spent years building. And for the first time in her life, that possibility didn't fill her entirely with fear. The ancient archives beneath the Moon Temple held secrets that predated the kingdom itself, their stone walls lined with scrolls and tomes that chronicled bloodlines stretching back through centuries of wolf history. Elder Thorn moved through the shadowed corridors with practiced ease, his gnarled fingers trailing along leather-bound spines as he searched for the records that might explain what Beta Marcus had come seeking. "The servant girl," Thorn murmured to himself, his voice echoing softly in the vaulted chamber, "found as an infant 20 years ago, brought to the temple wrapped in cloth, bearing no family markings, no identifying symbols." He paused before a particular shelf, his ancient eyes studying the faded labels. But there was something about that night, something the High Priestess ordered forgotten. Marcus waited patiently in the doorway, his warrior's instincts making him uncomfortable in this place of old magic and older secrets. The Alpha King's command had been clear: learn everything about the girl who had earned Kairos's recognition. But as the minutes stretched on and Elder Thorn's search grew more intense, Marcus began to suspect they were uncovering something far more significant than a simple servant's history. "Here," Thorn said finally, pulling a dust-covered tome from its resting place. The leather binding was cracked with age, and strange symbols were etched into its cover in silver ink that seemed to shimmer even in the dim torchlight. "The night she was brought to us, 20 years ago during the Silver Moon Massacre." The name sent a chill through Marcus's blood. Every wolf in the kingdom knew that story, the night when the ancient royal bloodline had been wiped out in a single devastating attack. The Silvermoon family had ruled for over 1,000 years before political enemies had orchestrated their destruction, slaughtering every member of the noble line to prevent any future claim to the throne. "You're not suggesting," Marcus began, but Thorn held up a weathered hand for silence. "The girl bears a mark," the elder said, opening the tome to a page covered in detailed sketches and notations. "Here, on her left shoulder blade. I noticed it years ago when she was brought to the infirmary with fever. A birthmark in the shape of a crescent moon, surrounded by 7 stars. Marcus leaned closer, studying the ancient illustrations that match Thorn's description exactly. According to the text, the marking was unique to the Silvermoon bloodline, appearing on every royal child born to that ancient house. It was said to be a blessing from the goddess herself, a sign that the bearer carried the blood of the first Alpha Kings. "That's impossible," Marcus breathed. "The entire family was killed, every last member accounted for and buried." "Every last member they could find," Thorn corrected, his eyes gleaming with the intensity of a man who had spent decades keeping dangerous secrets. But there were whispers in the aftermath, rumours of a child who had been spirited away in the chaos. The attackers searched for months, hunting for any surviving heir who might someday return to claim the throne. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. If the servant girl truly carried Silvermoon blood, if she was the lost heir everyone believed dead, then her presence in the kingdom represented a threat to the current political structure that went far beyond anything they had imagined. "The ancient powers would recognize her," he said slowly, pieces of a terrible puzzle beginning to fall into place. "Kairos, the sacred grove itself, they would know what she truly is even if she doesn't." Thorn nodded gravely. "The old magic runs deeper than pack hierarchy, deeper than political alliances. If she is who I suspect she might be, then her wolf has been suppressed by protective enchantments designed to hide her true nature. But such magic weakens over time, especially when the bearer experiences strong emotions or supernatural recognition." Marcus thought of the golden warmth he had seen flare between his Alpha King and the servant girl, the way Darius's entire demeanour had shifted when Kairos had chosen her. If the girl was indeed the lost Silvermoon heir, if her suppressed bloodline was beginning to awaken, then the mate bond recognition made perfect sense. The goddess would never pair an Alpha King with anyone less than his equal in power and heritage. "I need to report this to my lord immediately," Marcus said, his mind already racing through the political implications of such a discovery. But Thorn caught his arm as he turned to leave, the elder's grip surprisingly strong for such an ancient hand. "Be careful, young Beta. There are those in this kingdom who have built their power on the assumption that the Silvermoon line is extinct forever. If word spreads that the lost heir lives, if certain people learn that she is not only alive, but recognized by the Alpha King himself, her life will be in grave danger." Meanwhile, in the temple kitchens where servants gathered for their evening meal, Lyra sat apart from the others, as she always did, picking at the simple stew that constituted her dinner, while her mind churned with memories of her encounter with Darius the night before. The golden warmth in her chest had barely faded since their conversation, pulsing like a second heartbeat that seemed to grow stronger whenever she allowed herself to remember the way he had looked at her. "Maybe you're not nobody at all." His words echoed in her mind like a promise she was afraid to believe. She had spent her entire life being told exactly how worthless she was, how lucky she should feel to have even the most menial place in the temple hierarchy. But something in his dark eyes had suggested he saw past all of that, saw something in her that even she didn't understand. The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up from her bowl, and her breath caught in her throat when she saw Lady Seraphina gliding toward her table with predatory grace. The future Lunar Queen was even more beautiful up close, her golden hair gleaming like spun silk in the torchlight, her emerald gown perfectly tailored to show off her elegant figure. But it was the cold calculation in her green eyes that made Lyra's wolf stir uneasily beneath her skin. "You must be the little servant who caused such a stir in the sacred grove yesterday," Seraphina said, her voice carrying the kind of musical quality that spoke of years of training in court etiquette. She settled gracefully into the chair across from Lyra, ignoring the shocked stares of the other servants who couldn't believe a noble would willingly sit at their table. "My lady," Lyra murmured, starting to rise from her seat in deference to Seraphina's superior rank. "Oh, please don't stand on ceremony," Seraphina said with a smile that never reached her eyes. "I simply wanted to meet the girl who has everyone talking, though I must say I'm having difficulty understanding what all the fuss is about." The words were delivered with such casual cruelty that they hit harder than any shouted insult could have. Lyra felt the familiar ache of worthlessness settle in her chest, but this time it was accompanied by something else, something that felt almost like anger. The ancient sentinel's behaviour was unusual, Lyra said carefully, unsure how much she should reveal about what had transpired in the grove. "Unusual indeed," Seraphina agreed, her green eyes studying Lyra's face with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. "Though I'm sure it was simply a momentary confusion. Ancient creatures can be so unpredictable, can't they? Sometimes they see things that aren't really there." There was a subtle threat in those words, a warning wrapped in silk and delivered with a smile. Lyra felt her wolf respond to the challenge, pressing closer to the surface of her consciousness than it had ever done before. The sensation was both thrilling and terrifying, as if something long dormant was beginning to stir to life. "Perhaps," Lyra said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, "though Kairos has always seemed very certain about his choices in the past." Seraphina's perfect composure flickered for just an instant, a crack in her beautiful mask that revealed the calculating mind beneath. "Indeed. Well, I'm sure tomorrow's ceremony will proceed without any such disruptions. It would be unfortunate if anything interfered with the Alpha King's important political obligations." The emphasis on political obligations was unmistakable, a reminder of exactly where Lyra stood in the hierarchy of importance. But instead of the crushing defeat such words would normally bring, Lyra found herself thinking of the golden warmth in her chest, of the way Darius had looked at her as if she mattered. "Of course, my lady," she said quietly, "I would never wish to cause difficulties for the Alpha King." But as Seraphina rose to leave, her movements fluid and graceful as a hunting cat, she paused beside Lyra's chair and leaned down to speak directly into her ear. Her voice was so soft that only Lyra could hear it, but the words carried the chill of winter wind. "Good, because girls who forget their place have a tendency to meet with unfortunate accidents. The temple can be such a dangerous place for those who wander where they don't belong." Then she was gone, gliding away through the kitchen with the same predatory grace she had arrived with, leaving Lyra alone with the echo of her threat and the sudden understanding that her encounter with the Alpha King had painted a target on her back. But the strangest part was that instead of the paralyzing fear such a threat should have inspired, Lyra felt something else entirely. Her wolf was no longer content to remain hidden beneath the surface, and the golden warmth in her chest pulsed with what felt like defiance rather than submission. For the first time in her life, she found herself wondering what would happen if she stopped trying to be invisible, stopped accepting that she was nothing, stopped believing that she deserved whatever cruelty the world chose to inflict upon her. High above in his private chambers, Darius stood before the tall windows overlooking the temple grounds, his enhanced hearing having caught fragments of conversation from the kitchens below. His wolf paced restlessly beneath his skin, responding to what sounded suspiciously like a territorial challenge from his betrothed. The golden warmth in his chest had flared when Seraphina's voice had turned threatening, and he found himself taking an involuntary step toward the door before forcing himself to remain still. He had no right to interfere in conversations between the women in his life, no right to act on the protective instincts that seemed to flare whenever he thought of the servant girl. But as the minutes passed and his wolf's agitation only grew stronger, Darius began to wonder if his rights and obligations were about to come into serious conflict with something far more powerful than political necessity. The mate Bond, assuming that's what this golden fire in his chest truly was, cared nothing for kingdoms or alliances or carefully negotiated treaties. It cared only about the safety and happiness of the woman it had chosen for him, regardless of whether such a choice made any logical sense. And if Seraphina was foolish enough to threaten that woman, bond or no bond, she was going to discover just how protective an alpha king could become when something precious was placed in danger. The hidden temple archives felt different in the dead of night, their ancient stone walls seeming to pulse with magic that was older than memory, older than the kingdom itself. Elder Thorn led Lyra through corridors she had never seen before, his weathered hands carrying a torch that cast dancing shadows across shelves lined with forbidden knowledge. "What you are about to learn," Thorn said quietly, his voice echoing softly in the vaulted chambers, "will change everything you thought you knew about yourself. Are you certain you wish to bear this burden?" Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs as she followed him deeper into the archives, but the golden warmth in her chest pulsed with something that felt like destiny calling her forward. Since Seraphina's threat in the kitchen 3 days ago, her wolf had grown increasingly restless, pressing against barriers she hadn't even known existed until now. "I need to understand what's happening to me," she whispered. "The ancient Sentinel, the way I feel when the Alpha King is near, the things that are stirring inside me that I can't explain. I can't live in ignorance anymore." Thorn nodded and stopped before a section of the archive that looked older than the rest, where scrolls were written in silver ink that seemed to glow with its own light. He pulled out a tome bound in midnight blue leather, its cover marked with symbols that made Lyra's vision blur if she stared at them too long. "The Prophecy of the Lost Moon," he said, opening the ancient book to reveal pages covered in flowing script and detailed illustrations. "Written over 1,000 years ago by the first oracle of the Silver Moon bloodline." The name sent a shock of recognition through Lyra's entire being, as if her very bones knew the significance of those words, even when her mind struggled to understand. The golden warmth spread through her chest like liquid fire, and she had to grip the edge of the stone table to keep herself steady. "When the kingdom faces its darkest hour," Thorn read aloud, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of prophecy, "when false bonds threaten the balance of power, the lost heir shall return. Recognized first by the ancient guardian, then by the true king, she shall reclaim what was stolen and restore the sacred bloodline to its rightful place." The words seemed to resonate in the very air around them, and Lyra felt her suppressed memories stirring like creatures awakening from deep sleep. Images flashed through her mind, fragments of a life she had never been allowed to remember, a woman with silver hair singing lullabies in a voice like moonlight, strong hands lifting her high into star-filled darkness, the scent of jasmine and power that she now recognized as the smell of true royalty. "The massacre," she breathed, her legs suddenly weak as the terrible truth began to crystallize. 20 years ago, when the Silver Moon family was destroyed, I was "the youngest daughter," Thorn confirmed gently. "Princess Lyra Silvermoon, heir to a bloodline that stretches back to the goddess herself. Your parents died protecting your escape, and the guard who brought you here used the last of his life force to cast the suppression spell that has hidden your true nature all these years." The revelation hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and sending her wolf into a frenzy of recognition and fury. All this time, all these years of being told she was worthless, of accepting cruelty and invisibility as her natural state, she had been royalty. She had been the lost princess that bards sang about in taverns, the mysterious heir that political scholars debated in universities across the kingdom. "Why?" The word came out as a broken whisper. "Why hide me here instead of revealing the truth? Why let everyone believe the bloodline was extinct?" Thorn's ancient eyes filled with something that looked like profound sadness. Because those who orchestrated the massacre are still alive, still in positions of power. The spell that hides you also protects you, child, but magic that strong cannot last forever, especially when the bearer experiences the kind of emotional awakening you've been going through since the Alpha King arrived. As if summoned by the mention of his name, the golden warmth in her chest blazed brighter, and Lyra felt that familiar pull that seemed to draw her toward wherever Darius might be. The mate bond, she realized now with stunning clarity. Her wolf had recognized its true equal from the moment they had first laid eyes on each other. "The barrier is breaking," she said, and it wasn't really a question. She could feel it happening, like ice cracking under spring sunlight, releasing power that had been locked away for 2 decades. "Yes," Thorn confirmed, "and when it falls completely, when your wolf emerges in its full glory, everyone will know what you are. The silver fur, the royal markings, the power that flows in your veins, it will all be visible for the world to see." Fear and exhilaration warred in her chest as she processed the implications. If she truly was the lost Silver Moon heir, if her bloodline carried the kind of power Thorn was describing, then everything about her life was about to change in ways she couldn't even imagine. "But there's more," Thorn continued, turning to another page in the ancient tome. "The prophecy speaks of a choice that must be made, a decision that will determine not just your fate, but the fate of the entire kingdom." The illustration on this page showed 2 wolves, one silver and one black, standing together beneath a full moon, while a golden thread of light connected their hearts. Below them, armies knelt in submission, and above them, the goddess herself seemed to offer her blessing to their union. "The true king and the lost heir," Lyra whispered, recognizing the symbolism even as her rational mind reeled from the impossibility of it all. "Bonded by fate, destined to rule together," Thorn agreed. "But only if they choose love over duty, truth over political convenience. The prophecy warns that false bonds will seek to prevent this union, that those who profit from the current power structure will do anything to keep the lost heir from claiming her birthright." Seraphina's beautiful, threatening smile flashed through Lyra's mind, and she understood with crystalline clarity why the future Lunar Queen had felt the need to issue her warning. If Lyra was indeed the prophesied heir, if she was Darius's true mate rather than simply a servant girl who had caught his attention, then Seraphina's carefully negotiated political marriage was about to become worthless. "The suppression spell," Lyra said urgently. "How much time do I have before it fails completely?" Thorn studied her face in the flickering torchlight, his ancient eyes seeing things that went deeper than surface appearances. "Hours, perhaps a day at most. The emotional strain of the past few days, the mate bond recognition, your growing awareness of your true nature, all of it is accelerating the breakdown. When your wolf finally breaks free, it will be dramatic." As if responding to his words, pain lanced through Lyra's bones, sharp and sudden, and completely unlike anything she had ever experienced. She gasped and doubled over, her hands clutching at her ribs as something wild and powerful thrashed against the magical chains that had bound it for 20 years. "It's starting," Thorn said, reaching out to steady her as another wave of pain crashed over her. "The final breaking. Child, you need to find somewhere safe, somewhere private, before the transformation completes itself. When your wolf emerges, when the royal markings appear, there can be no hiding what you are." But even as the pain threatened to drive her to her knees, Lyra felt something else rising to meet it. Fierce joy, wild excitement, the intoxicating rush of power that had been denied to her for her entire life. Her wolf wasn't just awakening. It was celebrating, singing with the voice of ancient royalty as it prepared to reclaim its rightful place in the world. "The Alpha King," she managed to say through gritted teeth as another spasm racked her frame. "He needs to know what I am before—" "Before Seraphina tries to eliminate the threat you represent," Thorn finished grimly. Yes, child, but be careful. The political forces that arranged that massacre are still at work, and they will not hesitate to finish what they started 20 years ago if they discover you are alive. 3 floors above them, Darius paced his chambers like a caged wolf, his enhanced senses picking up distress signals through the mate bond that made his own wolf claw desperately at his control. Something was wrong. Something was happening to Lyra, and every instinct he possessed screamed at him to find her and eliminate whatever threat was causing her such obvious anguish. The golden warmth in his chest had turned into something more like golden fire, pulsing with urgency and protective fury that grew stronger with each passing minute. He had tried to dismiss it as imagination, tried to focus on his upcoming marriage to Seraphina and the political obligations that such a union would fulfill. But his wolf no longer cared about politics or obligations or carefully negotiated treaties. His wolf cared about its mate, and his mate was in pain. Marcus found him standing at the window, fully dressed despite the late hour, his hands clenched into fists at his sides as he stared down at the temple complex below. "My lord," the beta said carefully, recognizing the dangerous tension radiating from his Alpha King. "The dawn ceremony preparations are nearly complete. Lady Seraphina has requested a final meeting to discuss the—" "Cancel it," Darius said, his voice rough with barely contained power. "Cancel everything. Something is happening, Marcus. Something important." Before his beta could respond, a sound rose from the temple complex that made both men freeze in recognition. It was a howl, but unlike any either of them had ever heard, wild and musical, and filled with such raw power that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the ancient buildings. The voice of a wolf who was no longer content to remain hidden. The voice of royalty awakening to claim its birthright at last. And as the haunting cry echoed across the temple grounds, Darius felt the mate bond flare so brightly it was almost blinding, confirming what some part of him had known from the moment Kairos had bowed to a servant girl in the sacred grove. His true mate was no servant at all. She was something far more dangerous, far more precious, and far more politically complicated than he had ever dared to imagine. The lost silver moon heir had awakened, and nothing in the kingdom would ever be the same. The sacred grove felt different under the cover of darkness, its ancient oaks whispering secrets that only the night wind could understand. Lyra moved through the shadows with practiced stealth, her entire body still trembling from the revelation in the archives and the power that continued to claw at the weakening barriers around her wolf. She needed to see Kairos, needed the comfort of the ancient Sentinel's presence as her world crumbled and reformed around the impossible truth of her heritage. Princess Lyra Silvermoon. The words felt foreign in her mind, like trying on clothes that had never been meant for her small, insignificant existence. But as she approached the ring of standing stones where the great wolf rested, something in the air made her freeze. The wrongness hit her enhanced senses like a physical blow, scents that didn't belong, movements in the darkness that spoke of predators closing in for the kill. Kairos raised his massive head, amber eyes blazing with fury as low growls rumbled from his throat. He had sensed it too, the approaching danger that moved through the grove with deadly intent. 3 figures emerged from behind the ancient oaks, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods, silver blades gleaming in their hands with the kind of cold light that promised death. Professional killers, Lyra realized with crystal clarity, not common bandits or opportunistic thieves. These were assassins who had been paid to ensure she never left this grove alive. "The lost princess finally reveals herself," the leader said, his voice carrying the cultured accent of nobility, despite the murderous intent in his words. 20 years we've searched for you, little heir. 20 years of wondering if the bloodline truly died with your family." The suppression spell chose that moment to crack further, sending waves of agony through Lyra's bones as her wolf fought desperately to break free. She gasped and stumbled, her vision blurring as power she had never been trained to control surged through her veins like liquid lightning. "Seraphina sends her regards," another assassin added with cruel satisfaction. "She cannot allow complications to interfere with her political arrangements." Rage blazed through Lyra's chest, hot and fierce and unlike anything she had ever experienced. Her wolf, no longer content to remain leashed, pressed against the failing barriers with savage determination. She could feel it happening, the final shattering of the magic that had hidden her true nature for 2 decades. The first assassin lunged forward with inhuman speed, his silver blade aimed directly at her heart. But something extraordinary happened in that split second between life and death. The suppression spell shattered completely, releasing 20 years of accumulated royal power in one explosive burst. Lyra's wolf didn't just emerge, it erupted. Silver light blazed around her as her bones cracked and reformed, as her spine elongated and her face pushed forward into a muzzle. The transformation was violent and beautiful, agony transmuting into ecstasy as she felt her true self unfold for the first time in her life. When the light faded, a magnificent silver wolf stood where the servant girl had been moments before. Her fur gleamed like moonlight on water, and ancient runic markings glowed along her flanks in patterns that proclaimed her royal bloodline to anyone with eyes to see. She was larger than an ordinary wolf, more powerful, radiating the kind of supernatural presence that made the very air around her hum with magic. The assassins faltered, clearly not having expected their target to be capable of such a transformation. But they were professionals, and after a moment of stunned silence, they adapted to the new threat with deadly efficiency. Lyra moved with instincts that were both foreign and familiar, her untrained but supernaturally enhanced body flowing like liquid silver between the reaching blades. The royal bloodline that flowed in her veins carried memories of ancient battles, of warrior queens who had defended their kingdom with fang and claw. She caught the first assassin across the throat with claws that glowed with ethereal light, her strength far greater than any normal wolf could possess. He went down with a gurgling cry, his blood dark against the sacred ground. But there were still 2 more, and they had recovered from their initial shock. They came at her from different angles, coordinating their attack with the precision of killers who had worked together for years. Lyra dodged the first blade, but felt the second slice along her ribs, silver burning through her supernatural defences like acid. She howled in pain and fury, the sound echoing through the grove with such raw power that nearby windows in the temple complex shattered from the resonance. That's when she felt it, the answering call of another wolf, this one just as powerful as her own but darker, more primal. The mate bond flared like a beacon in the darkness, and she knew without looking that Darius was coming. The massive black wolf that burst into the grove moved with the deadly grace of a born predator, his eyes blazing gold with alpha fury as he took in the scene before him. His mate was bleeding, his mate was in danger, and nothing else in the world mattered except eliminating the threats that dared to harm her. He hit the second assassin like a force of nature, his jaws closing around the man's sword arm with enough force to shatter bone. The killer's scream echoed through the night as Darius shook him like a rag doll before flinging him against one of the standing stones with sickening finality. The third assassin, seeing his companions fall in rapid succession, decided that discretion was the better part of valour. He turned to flee, but Lyra was faster. Her royal wolf, now fully awakened and drunk on its own power, bounded after him with predatory joy. She brought him down just at the edge of the grove, her claws raking across his back as he fell. But instead of delivering the killing blow her wolf demanded, she found herself hesitating. The servant girl who had spent her life accepting cruelty still existed within this magnificent creature, tempering its savage instincts with something that might have been mercy. The assassin took advantage of her hesitation, rolling over and driving a hidden dagger toward her exposed throat. But before the blade could find its mark, massive black jaws closed around his wrist, and Darius finished what she had been too gentle to complete. In the sudden silence that followed, Lyra found herself alone in the grove with the Alpha King, both of them in their wolf forms, both of them breathing heavily from the violence of the encounter. The mate bond hummed between them like a living thing, stronger now than it had ever been, amplified by the shared danger and the protective fury that had driven him to her side. Darius shifted back to human form first, his powerful frame gloriously naked in the moonlight, his dark eyes burning with emotions too complex to name. Lyra followed his lead, her own transformation smooth and natural, now that the suppression barriers were gone forever. She stood before him in the sacred grove, silver hair flowing down her back like liquid moonlight, her grey eyes now flecked with amber that spoke of her royal heritage. The runic markings that had blazed on her wolf form were still faintly visible on her human skin, tracing delicate patterns along her arms and shoulders that proclaimed her bloodline to the world. "Princess Lyra Silvermoon," Darius said quietly, his voice rough with awe and something that sounded like reverence. "The lost heir, my mate." The words hung in the air between them like a vow, like a recognition of destiny finally fulfilled. Lyra felt tears streaming down her face, though she couldn't say whether they were born of joy or terror, or the overwhelming relief of finally being seen for what she truly was. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was apologizing for. For being more than she had appeared, for complicating his carefully ordered political life, for making his marriage to Seraphina impossible. But Darius stepped closer, his hands coming up to cup her face with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone so powerful. "Never apologize for being magnificent," he said, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "Never apologize for being exactly who you were born to be." Then he kissed her, and the mate bond exploded between them like golden fire, confirming what both their wolves had known from the moment they had first laid eyes on each other. They were meant for this, meant for each other, meant to stand together against whatever forces sought to keep them apart. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lyra could see the bodies of the assassins scattered around the grove like broken dolls. The evidence of Seraphina's attempt to eliminate her competition was undeniable, and the political implications were staggering. "She tried to have me killed," Lyra said, stating the obvious but needing to hear it spoken aloud. "Yes," Darius confirmed, his voice carrying the kind of cold fury that had made kingdoms tremble. "And she just made the gravest mistake of her life." Kairos approached them through the aftermath of violence, the ancient sentinel's amber eyes bright with something that looked almost like satisfaction. He had chosen well all those days ago in recognizing the lost princess, and now his Alpha King had done the same. As Lyra reached out to touch the great wolf's silver muzzle, she realized that everything about her existence had changed in the space of a single night. She was no longer the invisible servant girl who carried scraps to the sacred grove. She was Princess Lyra Silvermoon, heir to a bloodline that stretched back to the goddess herself, mate to the Alpha King, and target of political forces that would stop at nothing to prevent her from claiming her birthright. The real war was just beginning. But as she stood in the moonlit grove, with Darius's protective presence at her back and the ancient power of her bloodline singing in her veins, Lyra found that she was no longer afraid of the battles to come. She had been hiding for 20 years, accepting worthlessness and invisibility as her natural state. That time was over. The lost princess had awakened, and she was ready to fight for the destiny that had always been hers to claim. The Alpha King's private chambers had never held a secret this dangerous, this precious, this politically catastrophic. Lyra sat on the edge of Darius's massive bed, wrapped in one of his silk robes that dwarfed her small frame, while he tended to the silver-inflicted wounds along her ribs with gentle hands that trembled slightly from the aftermath of violence and recognition. The cuts are already healing, he murmured, his voice filled with wonder as he watched the supernatural regeneration that came with her royal bloodline. Your wolf is more powerful than I imagined possible. Lyra winced as he applied healing salve to the deepest gash, but the pain was nothing compared to the emotional upheaval of the past few hours. Everything she had believed about herself, about her place in the world, had been shattered and reformed in the space of a single night. She was a princess. She was his mate. She was the target of a political conspiracy that stretched back 20 years. "I still can't believe it's real," she whispered, her fingers unconsciously tracing the faint, silver markings that remained visible on her human skin. "All my life I've been told I was worthless, that I should be grateful for even the scraps of existence the temple allowed me, and now—" "Now you know the truth," Darius said, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made the mate bond flare golden between them. "You were never worthless, Lyra. You were hidden, protected, kept safe until the time came for you to reclaim what was always yours." The sound of her true name on his lips sent shivers through her entire being, but it was the raw emotion in his voice that made her breath catch. He looked at her as if she were something sacred, something precious beyond measure, and after a lifetime of being invisible, the intensity of his regard was almost overwhelming. "But what does this mean for us?" she asked, the question that had been burning in her chest since the moment he had kissed her in the grove. "For your kingdom, for the alliance with Seraphina's territory, for everything you've worked to build?" Darius's jaw tightened at the mention of his betrothed, and something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "Seraphina forfeited any claim to consideration the moment she hired assassins to murder my mate. The alliance was built on political convenience, but this—" he gestured to the golden warmth that pulsed visibly between them. "This is destiny. This is what the goddess intended." The certainty in his voice both thrilled and terrified her. Lyra had spent so many years accepting that she would never have anything of value, never be chosen, never matter to anyone. The idea that the Alpha King himself would risk everything for her seemed too impossible to believe. "Your people won't understand," she said quietly. "They'll see a servant girl who has somehow enchanted their king, not a lost princess with legitimate claims. Seraphina's people will call it madness, abandoning a crucial political alliance for the sake of supernatural superstition." Darius moved closer, his hands framing her face with the same reverence he might show to a holy relic. "Let them call it what they will. I've spent my entire life being the perfect political king, making decisions based on strategy and alliance and cold calculation. But when I saw those assassins threatening you, when I felt your pain through the mate bond, I realized that none of that matters if I lose the one person who makes me complete." His words sent golden fire racing through her veins, and Lyra felt her newly awakened wolf respond to the absolute conviction in his voice. This was what the ancient prophecies had spoken of, the recognition between true equals that transcended political boundaries and social hierarchies. "I don't know how to be a princess," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know anything about ruling, about politics, about being worthy of someone like you." "You stood against trained assassins with power you'd never been taught to control," Darius replied, his thumbs tracing the delicate silver markings on her cheekbones. "You've survived 20 years of cruelty and dismissal without losing your capacity for gentleness or mercy. You earned the recognition of the most ancient guardian in the kingdom when you were nothing more than a servant carrying his meals. If that doesn't prove your worth, nothing ever will." The mate bond flared brighter as he spoke, visible as golden threads of light that seemed to weave their hearts together. Lyra could feel his wolf calling to hers, could sense the depth of his need for her that went far beyond physical attraction or political convenience. "When I thought I might lose you tonight," Darius continued, his voice rough with emotion, "when I felt your terror through the bond and realized someone was trying to take you away from me before I'd even had the chance to claim you properly, I understood that nothing else matters. Not kingdoms, not alliances, not the approval of nobles who would never understand what we have. Tears streamed down her face as the full weight of his declaration settled in her heart. This magnificent, powerful man was willing to risk everything for her, willing to face the political chaos that would surely follow their bonding. "But the ceremony," she said weakly, grasping for rational objections even as her heart soared with hope. "You're supposed to marry Serafina tomorrow. The entire kingdom is expecting—" "The entire kingdom is about to learn that their Alpha King has found his true mate," Darius interrupted firmly, "and that the lost Silver Moon heir has returned to claim her birthright." Before she could respond, he leaned down and kissed her again, and this time there was nothing gentle or restrained about it. This was the kiss of a man claiming his mate, of an alpha who had found his perfect match and would fight the world to keep her. The mate bond exploded between them like liquid gold, and Lyra felt her wolf rising to meet his with fierce joy. This was what she had been born for, what her bloodline had been preserved to accomplish. Not just survival, but destiny fulfilled. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lyra could see the golden light of the completed bond reflected in his dark eyes. Whatever happened next, whatever political storms they would have to weather, they were truly mated now. Nothing could break the connection that blazed between them. "There will be consequences," she said, though her voice held more excitement than fear now. "Serafina won't take this quietly. Her family, her allies, they'll see this as betrayal, as breaking of sacred agreements." "Let them," Darius replied, his voice carrying the dangerous edge of an alpha who had made his choice and would defend it to the death. "Serafina showed her true nature when she tried to have you murdered. Any alliance built on such foundations was doomed from the beginning." A soft knock at the chamber door interrupted them, and Marcus's voice called from the corridor. "My lord, forgive the intrusion, but there are developments you need to be aware of." Darius sighed and pressed one more kiss to Lyra's forehead before moving to answer the door. When he opened it, his beta's eyes immediately went to the silver-marked woman sitting on the royal bed, and Marcus's expression shifted from concern to awe to understanding in rapid succession. "The lost Silver Moon heir," Marcus breathed, offering a bow that spoke of genuine respect rather than mere protocol. "My lady, the kingdom has waited 20 years for your return." "And now she's here," Darius said, his arm moving protectively around Lyra's shoulders. "What developments?" Marcus's expression grew grim. "Word is spreading about the assassination attempt. The temple servants found the bodies in the grove, and Elder Thorn has confirmed Princess Lyra's identity to those who needed to know. But there's more, my lord. Lady Serafina has requested an emergency meeting with you before dawn. She claims to have information about threats to kingdom security that require immediate attention." Lyra felt cold dread settle in her stomach. Serafina was moving fast, trying to control the narrative before the truth about her treachery could spread. No doubt she would spin some story about protecting the kingdom from dangerous pretenders, about the necessity of maintaining political stability in the face of supernatural claims. "She's going to try to discredit me," Lyra said quietly. "Make it seem like I'm some kind of imposter who has used dark magic to deceive you. Then she's about to discover exactly how protective a mated alpha can become," Darius replied, his voice carrying the kind of lethal promise that had made enemies flee before his army ever reached the battlefield. But Lyra caught his hand, her newfound confidence allowing her to meet his fierce gaze directly. "No, let me face her. Let me prove that I'm not the frightened servant girl she tried to eliminate. I am Princess Lyra Silvermoon, and I will not hide behind my mate's protection when someone threatens our bond." The pride that blazed in Darius's eyes at her words made her wolf purr with satisfaction. This was what it meant to be an equal partner rather than a protected possession, to stand beside her mate as he faced the political storms ahead. "Together," Darius said, his hand squeezing hers, "we face her together, as it should be." And as the first rays of dawn began to creep across the temple complex, Lyra realized that she was no longer afraid of the battles to come. She had found her true self, claimed her mate, and awakened to the power that had always flowed in her veins. Seraphina and her allies were about to discover that the lost princess was lost no longer. She was home, she was mated, and she was ready to fight for the destiny that 20 years of hiding had only made more precious. The great hall of the Moon Temple had been hastily transformed into a political battlefield, with representatives from both kingdoms gathered in the pre-dawn hours to witness what everyone suspected would be a confrontation that would reshape the balance of power across the territories. Lyra stood beside Darius at the head of the ancient chamber, her spine straight and her chin raised, despite the hostile stares directed at her from every corner of the room. She had chosen to wear a simple white dress that Elderthorn had provided, one that had belonged to her mother 20 years ago, and bore the subtle silver embroidery that marked it as royal garments. The ancient fabric seemed to glow against her skin, and the silver markings that traced her arms were clearly visible to everyone present, proclaiming her bloodline in a way that no political manoeuvring could dismiss. Lady Seraphina entered the hall like a queen already crowned, her golden hair arranged in an elaborate style that caught the torchlight like spun metal, her emerald gown cut to perfection and adorned with jewels that spoke of wealth and political power. She moved with the kind of predatory grace that had made her the most desired match among the noble families, but Lyra could see the cold calculation in her green eyes, the fury that burned beneath her perfect composure. "Alpha King Darius," Seraphina said, her voice carrying the musical quality that had charmed courts across multiple kingdoms. "I trust you've recovered from whatever confusion affected you during the night. Surely you can see that this person represents a threat to the stability we've worked so hard to achieve." The casual dismissal in her tone, the way she spoke of Lyra as if she were some kind of dangerous animal rather than a living being, made something dark and fierce stir in the newly awakened princess. Her wolf pressed against the boundaries of her human form, responding to the challenge with instincts that were both ancient and royal. "I see no confusion, Lady Seraphina," Darius replied, his voice carrying the kind of controlled authority that had commanded armies. "I see the recognition of truth that has been hidden for 20 years. Princess Lyra Silvermoon has returned to claim her birthright, and I have recognized her as my true mate." A murmur rippled through the assembled crowd, some voices carrying shock, others skepticism, and still others what sounded like genuine excitement. The return of the lost Silvermoon heir was the stuff of legends, the kind of story that bards sang about in taverns and children dreamed about in their beds. But Seraphina's laugh cut through the whispers like a blade through silk. "Princess, this common servant who has somehow enchanted you with parlour tricks and desperate seduction? My lord, surely you cannot expect us to believe that this creature carries royal blood." The word creature hit Lyra like a physical blow, carrying the same casual cruelty that had defined her entire existence in the temple hierarchy. But this time, instead of the familiar ache of acceptance and worthlessness, she felt something else entirely: rage, pure, clean, righteous fury that blazed through her veins like liquid fire. Her wolf, no longer suppressed or hidden, responded to the insult with violent protest. The barriers that had held her supernatural nature in check for 20 years were gone completely, and the power that flowed in her bloodline demanded acknowledgement, demanded respect, demanded recognition of what she truly was. "You dare!" Lyra said, her voice carrying a resonance that seemed to shake the ancient stones of the temple itself. "Speak to the rightful heir of the Silvermoon bloodline as if she were some kind of pretender seeking unearned glory." Golden light began to emanate from her skin as her wolf pressed closer to the surface, and the silver markings that traced her arms blazed with ethereal radiance. The assembled crowd took involuntary steps backward as supernatural power filled the hall, ancient and undeniable and absolutely royal in its presence. I have endured 20 years of being called worthless, Lyra continued, her voice growing stronger with each word as confidence flowed through her like wine. 20 years of accepting cruelty and dismissal as my natural due, of believing that I deserved nothing better than scraps and scorn. But I know the truth now, and I will not allow you or anyone else to reduce me to the frightened servant girl I was forced to become. Seraphina's perfect composure cracked slightly, a flicker of genuine fear passing through her green eyes as she witnessed the transformation taking place before the entire assembly. This was not the cowering temple servant she had expected to face, not the insignificant nobody she had tried to eliminate in the grove. This was royalty awakening to its full power, and it was magnificent. The bloodline marking, Elder Thorne said, stepping forward with an ancient scroll in his weathered hands. The crescent moon surrounded by 7 stars, visible here on Princess Lyra's shoulder. The same marking that appeared on every member of the Silver Moon royal family for over 1,000 years. He unrolled the scroll to reveal detailed illustrations that matched the silver patterns on Lyra's skin exactly, documentation that no political manoeuvring could dismiss or explain away. The proof was undeniable, written in her very flesh by the goddess herself. "Birthmarks can be forged," Seraphina said desperately, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Illusions can be created by those skilled in the darker arts. This proves nothing except that someone has gone to great lengths to create a convincing deception." But as she spoke, something extraordinary began to happen. Lyra's wolf, responding to the continued challenges to her legitimacy, began to emerge without her conscious direction. Not the violent, painful transformation that had occurred during the assassination attempt, but something controlled and deliberate and absolutely undeniable. Silver light blazed around her as her bones shifted and reformed, as her human shape dissolved into something far more magnificent. When the radiance faded, a wolf of impossible beauty stood where the princess had been moments before. Her fur was pure silver that seemed to capture and reflect every source of light in the hall, and the runic markings that had been faint on her human skin blazed like celestial fire along her flanks. She was larger than any ordinary wolf, more graceful, radiating the kind of supernatural presence that spoke of divine bloodline and ancient power. But it was her eyes that silenced every voice in the hall. They burned with golden fire that held depths of wisdom and authority that could only come from the oldest royal bloodlines, eyes that had looked out from the faces of queens and empresses for 1,000 years of Silver Moon rule. The assembled crowd fell to their knees as one, responding to an instinct older than politics or alliance, older than personal ambition or territorial dispute. They were in the presence of true royalty, and every wolf among them recognized it on a level that transcended rational thought. Even some of Seraphina's own supporters found themselves kneeling, their wolves responding to the undeniable call of royal blood despite their political loyalties. Only Seraphina herself remained standing, her face pale with fury and growing desperation as she watched her carefully constructed plans crumble around her. "Illusions," she repeated, but her voice carried no conviction now. "Sorcery designed to deceive the weak-minded." Lyra shifted back to human form with fluid grace, the transformation as smooth and natural as breathing. She stood naked in the hall for a moment, unashamed of her body or the silver markings that proclaimed her heritage, before Darius stepped forward to wrap her in his own ceremonial cloak. "Sorcery," she said quietly, her voice carrying easily through the silent hall, "cannot create what flows in the blood, cannot forge what is written in the very essence of a person's being, cannot fabricate the recognition of ancient powers or the acknowledgement of beings older than this kingdom itself." As if summoned by her words, a sound echoed through the hall that made every person present freeze in recognition. It was the howl of the ancient Sentinel, Kairos calling from the sacred grove, his voice carrying approval and acknowledgement that resonated through the temple stones like a benediction. "The ancient guardian confirms what we all can see," Darius said, moving to stand beside his mate with protective pride radiating from every line of his powerful frame. Princess Lyra Silvermoon has returned to us, and I have claimed her as my true mate. Any political arrangements that conflict with this recognition are null and void. The finality in his voice left no room for argument or negotiation. This was not a king making a request or opening a discussion. This was an alpha declaring his choice and daring anyone present to challenge his authority. Seraphina's mask of composure finally shattered completely, revealing the calculating fury beneath her beautiful exterior. "You would destroy everything," she hissed, no longer bothering to maintain her musical tone. "The alliance between our territories, the peace we've negotiated, the prosperity that our union would bring to both kingdoms, all of it sacrificed for the sake of supernatural superstition and political fantasy." "I would choose truth over convenience," Darius replied calmly. "Destiny over political expediency. The mate bond is sacred, Lady Seraphina, more sacred than any treaty or arrangement negotiated by men who never felt its call." The golden light that connected him to Lyra flared visibly in the dimness of the hall, undeniable proof of the supernatural connection that bound them together. Several of the assembled nobles gasped as they witnessed the mate bond in its full glory, a sight that few wolves were ever privileged to see. "Then you have chosen war," Seraphina said, her voice carrying the kind of cold promise that had toppled kingdoms. "My father will not accept this insult quietly, and our allies will see this betrayal for what it is. You may have your supernatural bride, Alpha King, but the cost will be paid in blood and sorrow across both our territories." But Lyra stepped forward then, her newfound confidence allowing her to face the woman who had tried to have her murdered with steady resolve. "Let them come," she said quietly. "Let all who would challenge the rightful order discover what happens when ancient bloodlines awaken to defend what is theirs. I am Princess Lyra Silvermoon, heir to a throne older than your father's entire lineage, and I will not be cowed by threats from those who mistake political manoeuvring for true power." The hall erupted in chaos as Seraphina's supporters began shouting objections, and Darius's allies voiced their approval. But through it all, Lyra remained calm and centered, her hand in her mate's and her wolf singing with fierce joy. She was no longer the invisible servant who carried scraps to the ancient guardian. She was royalty reclaimed, power awakened, destiny fulfilled, and she was ready for whatever battles lay ahead. The great hall had erupted into chaos following Seraphina's threat of war, with nobles shouting accusations across faction lines and the air thick with tension that threatened to spill over into violence. But Lyra found herself strangely calm at the centre of the storm, her newly awakened wolf steady and confident in a way that would have been impossible just days before. "Enough," Darius commanded, his alpha authority cutting through the cacophony like a blade through silk. The room fell silent immediately, every wolf present responding to the undeniable power in his voice. "Lady Seraphina, you have shown your true nature before this assembly. Your threats of war, your attempts to undermine the mate bond that the goddess herself has ordained, His dark eyes grew cold as winter stone. "Your unsuccessful assassination attempt against my mate." The accusation hung in the air like a death sentence, and Seraphina's face went pale beneath her perfect makeup. Around the hall, shocked murmurs began to rise as the implications of Darius's words sank in. "You have no proof of such wild accusations," Seraphina said, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "The ravings of a man bewitched by supernatural manipulation cannot be considered evidence of—" "The assassins you hired confessed before they died," Marcus interrupted, stepping forward with 3 signed documents in his hands. "Professional killers from the Western Territories, paid in gold that bore your family's crest. They were quite forthcoming about their employer once they realized their mission had failed." Lyra watched with fascination as Seraphina's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled completely, revealing the desperate fury beneath. This was the woman who had tried to have her murdered, who had seen her as nothing more than an obstacle to be eliminated. But standing here in the great hall, surrounded by the evidence of her royal bloodline and claimed by the most powerful alpha in the kingdom, Lyra felt only pity for the woman who had underestimated her so completely. "You would believe the word of common criminals over the sworn testimony of noble blood?" Seraphina demanded, her voice rising with hysteria. "This is exactly the kind of madness that proves this creature has corrupted your judgment with dark sorcery." But her protests fell on deaf ears. The assembled nobles had seen the transformation, had witnessed the undeniable proof of Lyra's bloodline, had felt the ancient power that radiated from her like heat from a forge. Whatever political manoeuvring might have been possible before was impossible now. "Lady Seraphina of the Western Territories," Darius said formally, his voice carrying the weight of royal decree, "you are hereby banished from this kingdom for the attempted murder of the Silver Moon heir and acts of war against the crown. You have 1 hour to gather your belongings and depart our borders. Any attempt to return will be considered an act of aggression." The finality of the sentence echoed through the hall, and Lyra felt something that had been clenched tight in her chest for days finally begin to relax. The immediate threat was over. The woman who had tried to eliminate her was being removed from power, stripped of her political influence, and sent away in disgrace. But as Seraphina turned to leave, her emerald gown swirling around her in a mockery of royal bearing, she paused to deliver one final poisoned dart. "Enjoy your supernatural prize, Alpha King," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "But remember that queens who are not born to rule have a tendency to fall from grace just as quickly as they rise to it." Then she was gone, sweeping from the hall with the remnants of her entourage trailing behind her like the survivors of a political shipwreck. The great doors closed behind them with finality, and Lyra felt as if a weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying had been lifted from her shoulders. "Now," Darius said, turning to face the assembled nobles with his arm around Lyra's waist, "we have more pleasant business to attend to. The mate bond has been recognized, the lost heir has returned, and it is time to make the arrangements that will formalize what destiny has already decreed." Elder Thorne stepped forward, his ancient eyes bright with something that looked like profound satisfaction. "The sacred texts speak of the requirements for royal mating ceremonies, particularly when one of the pair carries the Silver Moon bloodline. The rites are extensive." "Then we will observe every tradition, honour every requirement," Darius replied without hesitation. "Princess Lyra deserves a ceremony befitting her true status, not some hurried political arrangement designed for convenience." The warmth that spread through Lyra's chest at his words had nothing to do with the mate bond, and everything to do with the simple recognition that she mattered enough to deserve proper celebration. After 20 years of being treated as if her very existence was an inconvenience, the idea that anyone would go to such lengths to honour her seemed almost too wonderful to believe. "The ancient laws require 3 days of preparation," Thorne continued, consulting the scroll he had brought from the archives. "Purification rituals, bloodline confirmations, the blessing of the sacred grove and the ancient Sentinel. Only then can the formal bonding take place under the full moon." 3 days, Lyra repeated, feeling simultaneously excited and terrified by the prospect. 3 days to transform from invisible servant to royal bride, to learn how to carry herself with the dignity befitting a princess, to prepare for a role she had never imagined she might someday fill. But Darius squeezed her hand gently, his presence steady and reassuring beside her. "We have waited this long to do things properly," he said softly. 3 more days to ensure that every tradition is honoured, every blessing is given, seems a small price to pay for a lifetime together." The assembled nobles began to disperse, some clearly excited by the prospect of a royal wedding that would be spoken of for generations, others troubled by the political complications that Seraphina's banishment would create. But through it all, Lyra remained focused on the man beside her, the mate who had risked everything to claim her despite the chaos it would bring. "Are you certain?" she asked quietly as the hall began to empty around them. About all of this, about the choice you've made, about the consequences we'll both have to face? Darius turned to face her fully, his dark eyes holding depths of emotion that made her breath catch in her throat. I have been certain about very few things in my life, Princess Lyra Silvermoon, he said, his voice rough with feeling. Politics are always shifting, alliances always changing, the needs of kingdoms always evolving. But this, he gestured to the golden light that still pulsed between them, this is the most certain I have ever been about anything. Before she could respond, he was kissing her again, and the mate bond flared so brightly that several of the remaining nobles shielded their eyes from the radiance. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lyra realized that something fundamental had shifted in the way the others looked at them. They were no longer seeing an alpha king who had made a questionable political choice and the servant girl who had somehow enchanted him. They were seeing true mates, equal partners, a bonded pair whose connection transcended ordinary understanding. 3 days, she said, and this time her voice held excitement rather than fear. 3 days to prepare for a destiny she was finally ready to claim. As they made their way from the great hall toward the private chambers they would now share, Lyra caught a glimpse of movement in the high windows that overlooked the temple complex. Kairos stood silhouetted against the morning sky, his ancient form outlined by golden sunlight, his amber eyes watching over them with what looked suspiciously like approval. The great Sentinel had chosen well in recognizing her that first morning in the grove, and now his Alpha King had made the same choice. The lost princess had been found, the true mate had been claimed, and the ancient prophecies were beginning to unfold exactly as they had been written centuries ago. In 3 days she would no longer be Princess Lyra Silvermoon, lost heir returning to claim her birthright. She would be Lunar Queen, equal partner to the most powerful alpha in the kingdom, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring with the strength that came from being exactly who she was born to be. The thought filled her with fierce joy, and for the first time in her life, Lyra looked toward the future not with fear or resignation, but with eager anticipation for the adventures that awaited her. She had been invisible for 20 years. Now it was time to shine. The sacred arena had been carved from living stone centuries ago, its circular floor polished smooth by the blood and sweat of countless challenges that had determined the fate of kingdoms. Ancient runes spiraled outward from the centre in patterns that seemed to pulse with their own ethereal light, and the towering stone seats that ringed the fighting space were filled with representatives from across the territories who had come to witness what many believed would be the most significant ritual combat in a generation. Lyra stood at the edge of the arena, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what lay before her. The past 3 days had transformed her in ways that went far beyond the simple matter of royal preparation. Under Elderthorn's guidance, she had undergone purification rituals that had awakened aspects of her bloodline she hadn't known existed, had learned to channel the ancient power that flowed in her veins with something approaching control. But all the preparation in the world couldn't entirely silence the voice in her head that whispered she was still the frightened servant girl who had carried scraps to Kairos just a week ago. The challenger may enter the sacred space, Elderthorn announced, his voice carrying clearly through the arena despite his advanced age. Seraphina strode into the circle with the confident grace of a predator who had never known defeat, her golden hair braided back in an elaborate warrior's knot that left her beautiful face fully visible to the crowd. She had returned to the kingdom despite her banishment, claiming the ancient right of combat challenge that superseded even royal decree. Her emerald fighting leathers hugged her powerful frame like a second skin, and the ceremonial blade at her side gleamed with the kind of perfection that spoke of years of dedicated training. "I invoke the old laws," Seraphina declared, her voice ringing with absolute confidence as she faced the assembled witnesses. trial by combat to determine who holds the rightful claim to stand beside the Alpha King. Let the goddess judge between the pretender who hides behind supernatural trickery and the true daughter of noble blood who has trained her entire life for this honor." The crowd murmured with excitement and apprehension. Everyone knew that Seraphina was a formidable warrior, trained from childhood in the arts of combat by the finest masters her wealthy family could acquire. She had won tournaments across multiple kingdoms, had defeated male challengers twice her size, had earned a reputation as one of the most dangerous fighters of her generation. In contrast, Lyra had never held a weapon in anger, had never trained for battle, had spent her entire life learning to be invisible rather than formidable. But as she stepped into the sacred circle, feeling the ancient stones warm beneath her bare feet, something else stirred within her. The Silver Moon bloodline carried more than just royal heritage. It carried the memories of warrior queens who had defended their people with sword and claw, who had never yielded to superior numbers or political pressure. "The challenged may choose the terms of combat," Elder Thorn continued, his eyes meeting Lyra's with something that might have been encouragement. "Human form or wolf, weapons or natural gifts, single engagement or best of 3 encounters." Lyra felt her wolf stir beneath her skin, no longer suppressed or hidden, but fully awakened and eager for the chance to prove itself against this woman who had tried to steal what belonged to them. The silver markings on her arms began to glow faintly as supernatural power responded to her rising emotions. "Wolf form," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the arena. "Natural gifts only, single engagement until one yields or—" She paused, meeting Seraphina's cold green eyes directly. "Until one cannot continue." Seraphina's smile was sharp as a blade. "Excellent choice. I was hoping you would be foolish enough to rely on whatever supernatural tricks have convinced these people that you possess royal blood. It will make your defeat all the more satisfying." But as the two women moved to opposite sides of the sacred circle, Lyra felt something unexpected settle over her like a mantle. Calm, deep, scented calm that seemed to emanate from the very stones beneath her feet. This was what she had been born for, what her bloodline had been preserved to accomplish. Not hiding, not cowering, not accepting whatever cruelty the world chose to inflict upon her. From his position in the royal viewing area, Darius watched his mate prepare for the most dangerous challenge of her life, and fought every alpha instinct that screamed at him to leap into the arena and eliminate the threat to her safety himself. But ancient law forbade interference in ritual combat, and this was something Lyra needed to do for herself, needed to prove to the world and to her own heart that she was worthy of the crown she was destined to wear. The mate bond hummed between them like a living thing, carrying his strength and support across the distance that separated them, but also reflecting her growing confidence in ways that made his wolf purr with pride. "She's untrained," Marcus murmured beside him, voicing the concern that everyone could see written across Darius's face. "Seraphina has been preparing for combat her entire life." "Lyra has been preparing for this moment for longer than that," Darius replied, though his hands clenched into fists as the two women began to circle each other. "The bloodline remembers, Marcus. The wolf knows things that training cannot teach." At Elder Thorn's signal, both women began their transformation, and the arena filled with the sound of bones cracking and reshaping as human forms dissolved into their animal selves. Seraphina's wolf was exactly what everyone expected. Large and powerful, her golden fur gleaming with perfect health, her movements precise and controlled as years of training guided her every step. She was built for battle, all lean muscle and predatory focus, and she moved around the circle with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her own superiority. But when silver light blazed around Lyra and her wolf emerged, a collective gasp rose from the crowd. She was magnificent. Larger than Seraphina despite her smaller human frame, her silver fur seemed to capture and reflect every source of light in the arena, until she appeared to glow from within. The runic markings that had been faint on her human skin blazed like stars across her flanks, ancient symbols that proclaimed her heritage to anyone with eyes to see. But it was her eyes that silenced every voice in the arena. They burned with golden fire that held depths of wisdom and authority that could only come from the oldest bloodlines, eyes that had looked out from the faces of queens and empresses for 1,000 years of Silver Moon rule. Seraphina attacked first, using her superior training to close the distance between them with lightning speed. She was fast and precise, her jaws snapping toward Lyra's throat in a move that should have ended the combat before it truly began. But Lyra moved like liquid silver, flowing away from the attack with a grace that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The royal bloodline sang in her veins, guiding her movements with instincts that were older than civilization itself. For the first few minutes, it seemed as though Seraphina's experience would prove decisive. She landed several solid hits, her training showing as she used every advantage of leverage and momentum to drive Lyra back toward the edge of the sacred circle. The crowd watched in tense silence as blood began to stain silver fur, as it became clear that raw power alone might not be enough to overcome years of dedicated preparation. But then something extraordinary happened. Lyra stopped trying to fight Seraphina's way and embraced what she truly was. Instead of responding to attacks with trained counters, she began to move with the fluid unpredictability of a creature that had never been taught that certain things were impossible. Her wolf channeled the ancient magic of the Silver Moon bloodline, moving with supernatural grace that made her seem to be in 3 places at once. She flowed around Seraphina's attacks like water, struck from impossible angles, used the very stones of the arena to amplify her natural speed and agility. From the royal viewing area, Kairos released a howl of encouragement that echoed through the arena like the voice of ancient approval. The great Sentinel had chosen well in recognizing his true queen, and now she was proving herself worthy of that recognition. The turning point came when Seraphina, growing frustrated by her inability to land decisive blows, overextended herself in a desperate lunge that should have brought Lyra down. But the silver wolf was no longer there, moving with the kind of supernatural speed that left after-images in the air. When Seraphina hit the arena floor, Lyra was already behind her, jaws closing around her throat with just enough pressure to prove that she could have ended the combat at any moment she chose. For a heartbeat, the arena was absolutely silent. Then Lyra released her grip and stepped back, offering mercy to the woman who had tried to have her murdered, who had challenged her right to exist, who had threatened war rather than accept the mate bond that destiny had decreed. Seraphina lay on the arena floor for a moment, her golden fur heaving with exhaustion and defeat, her green eyes wide with shock as she realized that she had been comprehensively outmatched by someone she had dismissed as an untrained pretender. When she shifted back to human form, her perfect composure was finally completely shattered. She knelt in the center of the sacred circle, her head bowed in submission to the woman who had proven herself the superior wolf. I yield, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I acknowledge Princess Lyra Silvermoon as the rightful Lunar Queen. Lyra transformed back to human form with fluid grace, standing naked in the center of the arena as silver markings traced patterns of victory across her skin. She had proven herself not just to the assembled witnesses, but to her own heart. She was no longer the frightened servant girl who had carried scraps to the ancient guardian. She was the lost princess, awakened and victorious, ready to claim the crown that had always been her destiny. And as Darius leaped into the arena to wrap her in his arms, as the crowd erupted in cheers of approval and recognition, Lyra felt the last chains of worthlessness and doubt finally fall away completely. She was exactly who she was born to be, and she was magnificent.